what we focus on is this idea of broad-based employee ownership. So forms of ownership that provide a path to for at least all full-time equivalent employees to become co-owners of the business. So that can include that can include a variety of different mechanisms by which to do this. But the key is that it's not just something that, okay, there's a few folks in the business who can have ownership and it's employee owned by our definition, but it's something where it gives people from all walks of life the opportunity to build wealth, and have oftentimes a voice in the place that they work. So there's a bunch of research that's been done on employee ownership to start with to kind of frame it up, and I'd highly recommend some resources, including the National Center for Employee Ownership, or NCEO, has a number of articles on this sort of thing, and then the kind of cutting edge research really in the U.S. is being done at the Center for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at Rutgers University, and they have a great both resource library and curriculum library that you can really sort of go in and see what are the people every year sort of doing research on employee-owned companies, learning about them. But kind of condensing it all that down into, what are some of the impacts, right? The benefits to a business of being employee owned really are, and if you think about it, it makes sense intuitively. If the folks who work at the business own the business, they're going to have a reason to work both harder and in different ways than if they're purely an employee, because they have access to the benefit of the upside, right? So in big studies of employee ownership, we find that productivity tends to be higher. Companies that are employee owned tend to be more profitable, and the companies that are employee owned tend to grow faster, right? One nuance to this is the question of kind of participation in kind of management and information sharing. So when you kind of divide up and get into more details in the data, really what's found is that the bulk of these kind of gains come from companies that are good at doing financial information sharing, have high participation management practices, for a variety of reasons. So you could just implement something like an ESOP and say, oh, it's just another benefit. There's some financial thing, but it doesn't really affect your work life. But if you have if you have the ability to do a oops, sorry, we're going back here. If you have the ability to communicate and give people line of sight to what really what their individual bits of work are doing to impact the bottom line of the company, that's really when you see the really kind of increase in performance and engagement that employee ownership can bring. So from the perspective of communities and why we do this work as a nonprofit, right? Could have their employee-owned businesses are for-profit businesses that benefit their employees. So what's the benefit to communities and the broader world for having more of these in play, right? From the perspective of community economic development, right? There's this dynamic of stable jobs, and this is something that in many cases where communities might invest in supporting through things like tax credits or other forms of support, workforce development, that there's significant community investments made in companies, but companies could be something that's fairly mobile, and all right, tax credits or tax incentives in one place end, and so we're just going to move somewhere else. But for employee-owned companies, they tend to be stickier in that way, in that you have this group of employees who are embedded in the community, right? Their kids go to school, they have houses and homes, and and so it's less likely for that group to just arbitrarily decide, hey, we'd like to all pick up stakes together and move to South Carolina because that'll marginally influence the bottom line due to the tax environment or something like that. From the perspective of employees, they tend to stick around longer, right? Significantly longer. People might look at a job, something that might be just a stepping stone gig, and say, oh, well, if I'm an owner here, this might feel more like a career, right? And there's lower turnover, so which is the flip side. And and a lot of research has shown in things like recessions, they tend to do fewer layoffs, and there's a variety of ways that employee-owned companies can really be a community stabilizing force. So there's really two ways that employee-owned companies come into being as employee-owned, right? One is entrepreneurship. A company starts from the beginning as something that is sharing ownership broadly. This is something that works for some models and doesn't really work for others. And there's a whole lot of nuance around this kind of question of employee ownership from the start. But for a company and an entrepreneur who's thinking, hey, I really want to have something where, it's not, I have a team that's together committed to this and all willing to put in the work that's needed to make it happen versus the sort of single owner entrepreneur with a team of employees, very very kind of different dynamic. And so this is something that from the start you can build a culture around, everyone having a voice in governance and, team-based operations and decision making and all of those things that as the company grows, you can kind of get that culture baked in early. The other way, and this is something where the path that we see the majority of our work focused on is as a succession strategy. So someone owns a business, and for whatever reason, oftentimes retirement, but maybe it's a career change or some other life change that says, okay, that it doesn't make sense for me to own this business anymore. What am I going to do with it? There are a number of options for a business owner in that case, right? Probably the worst option is to simply liquidate. Put the assets up for auction. You sell it piecemeal, and you realize a little bit of value. Then there's selling to an outsider, selling to managers. In some cases, there's, intergenerational family transfer. So there's a number of different ways a business can pass on from one generation to the next. Uh, but selling to the broad group of employees is a pretty powerful way of doing this. And there's some interesting tax incentives and other things that can encourage this as well. And so there's a few kind of advantages around it. One I'd highlight is the idea of the flexible exit timeline. So if you're talking to an outside buyer, oftentimes that buyer is in a position where they're not going to sit around and wait for 5 or 10 years for the business owner to be ready to to sell the business. The um, you know the the whereas with an employee ownership sale, really that it can be. Oops, I lost the. Ryan, can you turn on the screen sharing? Here we go. There we go. We're back. Um, so the question of when to make the sale, an owner can really start the process when they're ready to do it. Um, it's something that really kind of from a perspective of a lot of business owners for whom legacy is a major consideration. It's something that for we see this a lot with folks who are in those kind of multi-generational family businesses where the next generation doesn't really want to take it over, right? But it has, there's a really important place in the community the business is embedded in. There's values and mission elements that are really important to the seller to have stewards of for the future. And that employee group can serve as those stewards in a fairly effective way in many cases, and something that they can feel good about in a way that they might not feel like that legacy is as being as well stewarded by another buyer. Um, there's the ability to you're essentially in many cases sort of creating a buyer. So in some models of employee ownership, right, it's something that allows for creating an internal market for the shares. So maybe the owner doesn't want to sell the whole business all at once, or there's a minority partner who the goal is to uh, have have exit. And so this can be a way to sort of have them be bought out but that kind of keeps it within the company. So when thinking about the actual universe of employee ownership structures, the ways of making this this model work, uh, there's really kind of three main ones that we work with. But of course, there's a whole universe of bespoke options, right? Where you can design ownership in ways that can accomplish the goals of broad-based employee ownership. One great example in Vermont is Chroma Technologies, right? In many ways, they're kind of neither fish nor fowl. They're neither kind of like a worker. They have some elements of things that might look like a worker co-op. There's other elements that look like an employee stock ownership plan. but they've been able to make it work for decades. So don't, when you're thinking about employee ownership, don't feel limited by these options, but these are the ones that have the most experience, the most common. You can find peers who are doing them, that sort of thing. So the three we'll talk about today are the worker-owned cooperative, which involves kind of a direct form of ownership by the employees and governance by employees. The employee stock ownership plan, which is basically a mechanism through which the employees own the company kind of through their retirement plan, with all of both the tax advantages and extra administrative elements that entails. And the employee ownership trust, which is a newer form of employee ownership that in the US, but that has been around for for at least a century in the UK, and has been and is kind of an interesting third option that we tend to find sellers who particularly have a strong legacy considerations find to be compelling. So with worker co-ops, right, to step back just a little bit, to think about what is a co-op, right? It's a specific kind of business that is differentiated from other kinds of business. It's for profit, but in a way it operates kind of on a not. Its goal is to operate on a not-for-profit basis towards its members, and that kind of looks different for the different kinds of co-ops. I think most people, when they hear the word co-op, might think of something like a food co-op, which is a cooperative owned by its customers, or a big agricultural co-op like Land O'Lakes or Cabot or Ocean Spray. Right, in the agricultural sector, there are these big farmer-owned cooperatives that market the farmer's produce, and cooperatives are generally defined by as types by which stakeholder groups owns it. Consumer co-ops, right? Those food co-ops, credit unions, housing co-ops, right? They're owned by their customers. Those producer co-ops or marketing co-ops are owned by the folks who sell products through the co-ops. And then worker co-ops are cooperatives that are owned by their employees. And so there's just a couple of concepts that are important to understand about the worker co-op. It's, when you think about ownership generally, the two big elements of it to always sort of ask a question about, to understand really how does the ownership design of any particular thing work, are control and profit, right? If you own something, you have the right to, in general, like if you're thinking about a car that you might own, you have the right to control it, drive it around, do what you like with the car within certain guardrails. And if you sell the car, the proceeds of that sale belong to you, right? And so how those things play out in these different models, are kind of have some nuances to them that are important to understand. So with worker co-ops on the control side, well, we'll talk about finance first and then control. So on the financial side, that someone goes to work for one of these co-ops, they generally start as an employee. They might work a year or two to prove that, all right, they're a good fit, and then they're offered the opportunity to buy in, and they purchase a share, and that share is what gives them member ownership. Each member only owns one share, and that share's price is not connected to the market valuation of the company, but is instead a fixed value. And so there's a pretty wide variation in how much that share is. On the one hand, there's a co-op, when we did a survey of co-ops in Vermont, on the low end was a company that had some mostly part-time people, very not a lot of money going through. It was $250, right? You put in your $250, you get your share, you become a member. On the other end of the spectrum is a company that for whom it's 15,000, and they have a good amount of profit to share. They let people put a down payment and then pay in installments over time, so you don't have to come up with the 15,000 all at once. But if you're realizing enough additional profit beyond your normal compensation to really make it worthwhile to put that kind of money in. And so everyone owns that one share, and that share entitles them to a share of profits. And the way that profits are divided up in a worker co-op is on the basis of the amount of the work that is contributed by the members. And so that can be operationalized in two ways. It can be either hours worked, right? So everyone earns their salaries or their hourly wages at the W-2 income level, and then at the end of the year, the company divides up the profit. They say, okay, here are all the full-time people. They all get an equal share of profit. Someone who worked part-time, say 20 hours a week, gets half of what someone who worked 40 hours a week gets. And some of that might be paid out in cash immediately, and some of that might be retained in the company as working capital for a few years until the company has enough working capital and then starts paying it out. And the company refers to that mechanism for tracking the amount of retained profit, which is essentially folks' equity in the company, as people's internal capital account. And so so there's that kind of each year you can kind of track how much of the retained profit you have built up, and will eventually, if the company keeps doing well, be paid out in cash. The other thing that the member share entitles you to is a vote. So in general, you have an annual meeting or something similar, and the members vote to elect a board of directors, and that board of directors is then responsible for overseeing management and policy and big strategic considerations for the company. In very small worker co-ops, and I'd say technically you can do a worker co-op with as few as 3 people. We usually like to see like 4 to 5 at minimum for sort of redundancy and and that sort of thing. But the I'd say up to maybe 7 to 9. It's oftentimes the case that all members are going to be part of the board, and once a quarter or once a month, you take your employee hat off and put your board hat on and do the board work. In bigger companies, then you have a subset of members who are elected and might have some outside directors as well. So this kind of gives you a sense of the kind of circular flow of accountability and authority that co-op governance entails, right? So you have the subset of the full employee group, which is the membership, who are the owners. They elect the board on a one member, one vote basis. That board can have outside directors. If it does, usually those outside directors representing different perspectives or skills that aren't found inside the membership, are oftentimes elected by the existing board, but could also be elected by the membership. That board selects and supervises the general manager, CEO, right? So they provide guidance for policies, right? Oversee the budget, and if there's major issues with that, might and ultimately does have the power to fire the CEO if need be. And then the CEO in turn has operational control and authority usually. So they have the power to hire and fire staff, set up management and operational structures, and so there's this accountability of the members who are the employees are being supervised by the general manager, CEO, but also have a strong incentive for that person to be performing well and doing a good job, because they are financially impacted by the performance of that CEO outside of their normal compensation. So the second mechanism that I'll talk a little bit about is the employee stock ownership plan. So whereas the worker co-op is something that's viable for very small companies, let's say again could do 3 if it in the right circumstances, but really 4 to 5 kind of core committed employees who are willing to be founding members. The employee stock ownership plan has requires companies to be a bit larger, and we don't see examples of companies starting up from scratch as ESOPs. It's pretty much always a succession plan. So very rough kind of guideline of roughly 20 employees, 3 million in value, maybe $500,000 a year in EBITDA profit, as the kind of starting point. But in certain cases you can go lower than that. But so the most important thing to understand about the ESOP is that it's an ERISA qualified retirement plan. So ERISA is the kind of omnibus legislation that governs American pension law that was passed in 1974. And so the ESOP is a special form of retirement plan that exists to primarily own company stock in the company where the employees work, right? So it exists to own the company. And it's the only kind of retirement plan that can borrow money. And so basically what this mechanism allows the company to do, the plan to do, is you can form this plan, the company makes pre-tax retirement contributions into it, the plan can take out a loan by the company and then pay back the loan through that, in a tax advantaged way through those the funds coming in through those retirement plan contributions. And as the loan is paid down, the shares are released into people's accounts. And so over time, as the company makes those annual contributions as a percentage of payroll to the employees build equity in the company in their retirement plan. So when we were thinking about financial benefit and control, right? In the case of an ESOP, controls all because it's a retirement plan. Control heavily is heavily invested in the role of trustee of that plan. That trustee, because they're the trustee of a retirement plan, have a strong kind of legal obligation and fiduciary duty to the plan beneficiaries, right? Those employee owners, to act in their best interest. And if the trustee goes off the rails, the Department of Labor can come in with, with their baseball bat and clean house, essentially. Um, and so the trustee, in certain cases, there can be forms of more direct governance where the employees vote their shares and and make certain decisions. But that kind of fiduciary duty piece for the trustee is very strong, and so it's most decisions are kind of going to go ultimately be at the governance level through that trustee. Those big decisions like should we sell the company? Those are the things that might go to a pass-through vote. So the tax advantages of an ESOP are pretty significant and important to understand. And there's a few of them. So the main one that is one of the reasons why we tend to see most companies who go ESOP go 100% all at once is that if the company is an S corporation, right? There's C corporations and S corporations. S corporations in general can only be owned by a limited number of individuals and are pass-through entities. So the corporation doesn't pay tax. All tax liability kind of passes through to the owner at the personal level. An ESOP trust is one of the few non-natural persons that is actually allowed to own an S corporation. And because an S corporation is that pass-through entity, the plan has no, has no tax liability. Now, taxes are paid by the beneficiaries when they retire and they receive their retirement benefits, just like the beneficiaries of a 401k. So the government eventually will get their due. But from a company operating perspective, the company has basically no federal income tax liability. And so that's that allows the company to sort of have some extra cash flow that it can use for what's called the repurchase obligation of buying back shares. It can use that for investment and in the expansion of the company and even acquisition. There's a number of companies in the ESOP world who've grown by building up cash and then buying another company and bringing that employee group into their employee ownership plan. The other thing that's true both for ESOPs and worker co-ops for a selling owner is the ability to defer paying capital gains taxes if you sell at least 30% of the company to one of these structures. Now, there's a bit of a sort of trade-off in the ESOP world in terms of this. An owner can only qualify for that if the company is a C corporation, and so there's either the operate post-transaction essentially tax-free as an S corporation, or allow the owner to benefit from this tax incentive, but remain a C corporation for a period of years. That trade-off doesn't exist for worker co-ops because there isn't that operating tax-free because it's a direct form of ownership, not a form of ownership through a retirement plan. And in 2027, this tax incentive, which is called the 1042 rollover, is going to be extended in a small way up to 10% of the sale price to S corporation ESOPs as well. So we're going to see I think we're going to see more usage of that, and hopefully that is a bit more of an incentive for more business owners to create these types of structures. So when thinking about what kind of company is a good candidate for an ESOP, right? There's a few considerations, right? One is financial, right? Stable cash flow. So because this is almost always going to be a leveraged transaction where there's some money coming maybe from a bank, and then the selling owner also essentially making a loan and being paid out for a portion of the sale price over time with interest. The company needs to be able to confidently project that it will be able to generate enough cash to comfortably make those loan payments until they're paid off. And so for a company that's in a moment of massive growth where you're needing to bring in a bunch of capital and lever up for other reasons, or sort of sometimes very cyclical companies, this can be challenging where I remember talking to a lumber mill about this, and they were kind of in a situation where they would have like 1 or 2 years where they were just making, printing money, and then 1 or 2 years where they were losing money terribly and like worrying about folding and maybe having to sell off some assets to just keep in business. And so, and having this ongoing up and down and up and down. And so companies like that can be more challenging for this versus companies that have a really stable business, mature business model with clear cash flow. The second piece is about the employee base. So, one thing I'd say for all employee ownership that's kind of a green flag that whenever I look at a company and say, okay, well, is there possibilities here? Is a base of committed employees, right? So longevity, folks who've stuck around, and a culture of sort of trust and mutual respect. And there's this question of like, you know, um, can the employees imagine themselves owning a business together with each other, right? If it's something where the business owner really has had the role of processing all and mediating all the conflict and everything else so that, things like the wheels stay on the cart while they're in that role, but if you take them out of that position, all of these suppressed things might come out and and so it's one of those things where if you don't have that culture of trust, it's not necessarily a no forever, but it's a hey, that's something that the company would need to work on before really it could be really successful on this front. This is a bit less of an issue with ESOPs than with worker co-ops because it's of that more indirect role of the trustee, so there's less active governance that the employees are having to engage in, and but nonetheless, that's still sort of an important thing to be looking for, and really is a signal for success, I'd say, if that's present. And the other thing about the employee base is the demographics, and this is something that will be looked at by kind of any sort of feasibility study. But if you've got a company where you've got you know whole most of the workforce in late 50s early 60s, and so there's this kind of wave of retirements coming as you project out to be like, okay, how much money do we need to set aside for buying shares back as people retire? How challenging will it be to sort of replace a significant amount of the workforce versus a company that has few people in their 60s, few people in their 50s, few people in their 40s, et cetera, right? So it's more spread out. That's something that definitely is better for an ESOP perspective than something where you have a lot of concentration in one age group that's getting near retirement. And then the sort of question of kind of a flexible exit and financing. So, this is something where, when thinking about where does the money come from, right? And there's it's the leverage buyout thing that I talked about, but from the perspective of the owner, the more that the owner's willing to sell or finance, the simpler the deal potentially is, right? That's not to say that you can't have a deal where the owner walks away from the table with a pretty significant chunk of change in their pocket. But every time you add a lender, it adds some complexity. And so, if it's a position where okay, the owner's like, oh yeah, I'm happy to be paid out with interest over 5 to 7 years and don't need to involve anyone else, that's the easiest case. And then although there's some things that in the lending environment for ESOPs that have changed, and particularly watching SBA loan guarantees. So for many years, they were really not a tool that could be used for ESOP deals because of the personal guarantee issue. And there's this issue where, okay, if the owners are the beneficiaries of a retirement plan, that trustee is usually a professional trust company or something. It's not the thing that's going to make the personal guarantees. Retirement plan beneficiaries, right? They can't really make personal guarantees either. So it left ESOPs in this kind of limbo around this lending that would allow for banks to take on a lot bigger portion of the total deal versus seller financing. Recently, finally, after many years of advocacy, those rules have changed, and I've been starting to hear about deals that involve SBA loan guarantees. And it's still very early to understand exactly like how big of an impact that's going to have. But in many cases, if it goes the way that we're hoping, it's going to mean that there's a lot of cases where owners are able to walk away with the majority or more of the sale price on in their pocket on day one, which will mean more owners will find this interesting and desirable versus the ones who are highly motivated to make this happen and willing to be paid out over a longer period of time as a result. So the third mechanism here is the employee ownership trust, and so as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a model that has been around for more than a century in the UK. The United States has not been able to do it until fairly recently because for a long time we had a law called the Rule Against Perpetuities, which basically says you can't create a trust that is designed to exist forever. With the exception of a trust designated for the maintenance of a cemetery, right? Because I want to have the lawn mowed indefinitely. Those rules have changed significantly in the last couple of decades, and so the EOT is something that we're now seeing, some interest in, and some deals starting to pop. One thing to understand about the EOT is it's really a subcategory of a broader approach to ownership called a perpetual purpose trust, and and so in some ways, therefore, it's a more kind of like flexible thing, but also doesn't have as clearly defined sort of tax benefits as the ESOP and in some ways the worker co-op have, right, which are much more templatized. But the perpetual purpose trust basically owns property on behalf of a defined purpose. In this case, it would be owning a company, and it can have multiple purposes. So a famous example in the last few years of a company transitioning ownership to a perpetual purpose trust can be seen in Patagonia, where the family, kind of for mission, for kind of environmental mission related and stewardship related reasons, decided that was what would own the company after that. And so in the case of an employee ownership trust as a subcategory of this perpetual purpose trust model, the company or the company is owned by the trust for the purpose of benefiting current and future employees. And what that sort of means that kind of has a few implications that differentiate it in meaningful ways from the ESOP and worker co-op model, right? One big piece is this kind of question of the how value is delivered to the employees. So with the ESOP, there's an annual valuation. People build up shares, and their value is basically the capital gain of the market value of the company of the shares that they received as a retirement benefit, right? So the valuation of the company is kind of at the center of how value is delivered to employee owners. With a worker co-op, there's no valuation that needs to be done once the worker co-op has actually been created, right? The value is shared with folks on the basis of profit, and so and some of that profit might be retained, and so there's this kind of this value, that's specific number that's held inside the company that the employee will eventually be paid out. And so in both cases, there's to a greater extent with the ESOP and to a lesser extent with the worker co-op, there's this important thing to consider from a management and sort of planning perspective called the repurchase obligation. And that repurchase obligation essentially means that you need to sort of be setting aside and planning and looking at retirement workforce demographics, retirement ages, other things like that, because you know that as people leave, the company is going to need to come up with funds to buy back and buy out their stake in the company. And so for worker co-ops, it's a predictable number. For ESOPs, if they can sometimes run into some issues where if they're almost like being victims of their own success, where they grow very quickly, the valuation gets much larger, and then they're like, oh, we didn't actually plan to be this valuable, and so we need to take out a loan or other things to kind of manage that repurchase obligation. The employee ownership trust doesn't have a repurchase obligation, and I think that's one of the big differentiators, right, which kind of both limits the sort of financial benefit for employees, but also makes it so that it's from the perspective of someone who might, from a mission or legacy perspective, want to really ensure that the company is going to be, say, permanently independent, is a kind of one of the implications of doing that. So in the UK, they refer to this kind of as naked in, naked out, right? So the employees come in, they don't put any money in, right? They just start working there, and the benefit of working there is that when there's profit, that profit is distributed to the employees. But then when they leave, right, and they're no longer an employee, they have no further claim to the value or the profitability of the company, right? So it's something that while you're working there, if it makes a profit, you benefit, but you don't benefit from the market value of the company. You benefit from the profitability, and there's not like something where, oh, we've retained some profit and now we're going to pay it out to you later like a worker co-op. It's really just there's profit to distribute this year, you'll get a check. Because it's something that's not as well defined in terms of governance, either by law in the case of ESOPs or by sort of international principles in the case of co-ops, the governance is very flexible. And this is one of those places where you can create a multi-stakeholder thing where there's multiple priorities or purposes for the trust, right? And so governance could look like something very similar to a worker co-op, where it's simply the trustees are elected by the employees each year, and or in rotating seats. It could be something where seats are set aside for if it was a family business where family legacy is important and the name is still going to be on it, where maybe a family member will in perpetuity have a seat at the table to be part of conversations about the future of the company that they founded and used to own. There might be uh, you know an additional purpose where the company has a particular social mission, charitable cause, other thing that it has for a long time supported, and the owner wanted to sort of make sure that support would continue as long as the company continued. In which case, there might be a trustee seat or a board seat that's set aside for a representative of a nonprofit that specializes in that particular cause or something like that. And so in many ways they're kind of the guardians of that particular piece of the mission. So there's a lot of different reasons or things that can be baked into this trust model, and because of its flexibility. But on the flip side, right, it's not a retirement plan, so it doesn't have those big tax benefits of the ESOP, but it also doesn't have the overhead of having to do an annual valuation and having to have a plan administrator for the ESOP plan, and a number of things that make it more costly. So a lower profit company and a smaller company could do an employee ownership trust, that for whom an ESOP might not be a feasible option. In that sort of there's that kind of trade-off where it's on the one hand, if you have a lot of tax benefits, that also means that the government has a lot more of a reason to oversee and make sure that there aren't abuses of those things happening. And so there's some fairly heavy regulatory apparatus versus something like this where you're operating within basically normal, well-defined trust law. There's a lot more flexibility in how things can be done, and it doesn't need to be as standardized as it does for something that's more highly regulated. And then one other kind of element, and this is another place of comparison between these different models to think about, is independence of the company, and if that's a value that a business owner is wanting to have as part of the reason that they're engaging in employee ownership. And there's sort of a continuum of how strong of a mechanism each of these three forms of employee ownership are for maintaining independence. On the one end of the spectrum is the ESOP, right, where uh, there's it's something that in many ways that employee group can be stewards of the legacy and all of that. But there is the fiduciary duty piece that the trustee has, and so that trustee, if in certain cases, if say the company were to have a competitor come in or strategic buyer come in and say, all right, we're willing to offer 5 times your latest kind of market rate valuation to buy the company. From the perspective of retirement plan beneficiaries, having the value of your retirement plan, let's say built up, $200,000, having it increased by 5 times overnight to $1 million, that's life-changing money. And so, the trustee being, having a duty to the future financial well-being and retirement well-being of the employee owners might actually be legally sort of compelled to accept that kind of offer because it is life-changing money, and might even be open to liability if they don't. So there's in many ways of saying, okay, for the most part, ESOPs might have the value and the goal of maintaining independence, but there's ultimately that thing where it's not a kind of firm lock. The worker co-ops are sort of in the middle in that oftentimes they'll have written into their bylaws mechanisms that either say if the company is sold, the proceeds aren't just distributed to current members, but have to be paid out to former members over a look-back period of say 5 or 10 years. And even there's some worker co-ops that have poison pills in their bylaws that say, if they're bought, everyone will be made whole, but any profit beyond that has to be donated to a mission-aligned nonprofit. Equal Exchange, which is a worker co-op, fair trade importer, that was probably one of the originators of this approach, and their approach is used by a number of co-ops I'm aware of, where they essentially say, yeah, if we're sold, any windfall will go to a fair trade nonprofit to continue advancing the mission for which we were founded. But ultimately, those kinds of rules, are the impact of them is limited by the fact that fundamentally the governance of a worker co-op is democratic, right? The members elect the board, one member, one vote, and there are always kinds of mechanisms by which the bylaws can be changed. You might set a very high mechanism, say, all right, it needs 2/3 or 3/4 majority, or maybe even consensus in some cases. But nonetheless, ultimately, the company is controlled by the employees, and if they are really motivated to sell the business or do something that limits the independence of the business, uh, and there's a consensus around it or pretty close to a consensus around it, they can make that happen. Um, Whereas with the trust, that trust document can be written up in a way that's pretty legally ironclad to say, to define either permanent independence or, only certain conditions, right? Businesses might be going under, and the board of trustees might be like, all right, well, we should do the strategically best thing to realize value versus just letting it peter out, things like that. But so for business owners for whom that kind of legacy and independence thing is a highly motivating factor, this is the employee ownership trust is the strongest mechanism by which to accomplish that of these three. So regardless of which mechanism is being used, there's kind of the process by which a company can become employee owned through this kind of sale to the employees, one way or another. They're at a high level, they look fairly similar, right? So it starts off with a business owner doing some investigation, start thinking about, hey, do I want to sell my business? In some cases, it's I've seen it being an employee group who are like, oh, I know the owner's 80, and I'm worried about what's going to happen 10 years or 5 to 10 years. So what information should I bring to the table about this? But one way or another, there's this exploration that happens to be like, hey, is this something we want to do? And that usually involves evaluation and feasibility study and other things that can kind of take it from that's an interesting idea to, yeah, either we think it would work, or now we really don't think it will work. And then it sort of differentiates a little bit depending on which path you're going. For worker co-ops, generally, it's at that point the group of employees will form a steering committee and kind of directly represent themselves through the process. Talking through how are they going to govern themselves, making sure they understand the business plan, talking to lenders, things like that, right? So it's a really more of a direct, there's a buy side and sell side, and the employees are involved from early on. In ESOPs, it's oftentimes, in many ways, it's the trustee. The trust is being created by the seller, by the company, and because the employees aren't actually putting any of their own money directly in, right? With the co-op, you're buying a share. With the ESOP, it's something where the employees are receiving ownership as a benefit through these retirement plan contributions. So it's often the case that the employees might not actually know officially that this is happening until it has happened, because in some ways there's you don't want to raise expectations before and then have the thing fall apart. In other cases, certainly there's I've seen cases where employees are quite involved and aware of it from early on. I think it really is kind of a question of company culture and the nature of the relationship between the owner and the employees that really defines that. But so in the case of the ESOP, then it's not the employee group that's representing the buy side of the transaction, but the trustee. And so the trustee kind of is formed, hires its own valuator, is able to kind of talks to lenders, is sort of able to make its offer. But what one way or another, and similarly, somewhat similarly with the employee ownership trust as well, right? The kind of the trust as the buy side. The owner and the buyers need to agree on a sale price, and that in the case of an ESOP, that sale price is something that is it can pay financial value for the business, right, based on the profitability and things like that. It can't pay strategic value. So if there's a private equity firm that's doing a roll up, or a competitor who sees kind of synergies with your company, might be able to offer a higher price than an ESOP could offer. But the tax benefits of selling to the ESOP might actually sometimes outweigh that. So it's always important to really kind of dig down into the numbers. But in general, if these deals are being financed, right, in many ways, the most that it can pay is going to be defined kind of by what what it can leverage, what it can borrow, and what it can afford to pay off. And most lenders use metric called the debt service coverage ratio, and like, they like to see a debt, which is basically that, like, how much buffer would be left over given your expected financial performance, right? And after you've paid all of your debts, paid all your expenses, everything else, right? Because the world is variable. So if you have a debt service coverage ratio of say 1.2 or 1.25, you expect to have 25 cents for in addition, as buffer for every dollar. That allows for that's kind of a metric that will be looked at, and in some ways you can use that to kind of back into what is a price that the company could afford, that would still yield that, because if the price goes too high, the margin becomes tighter, and it becomes harder to say yes to a loan. So, in the case of co-ops, oftentimes the Cooperative Fund of the Northeast in our region is the first stop, and they're a nonprofit loan fund that specializes in lending to cooperatives, for talking through that. On the ESOP side, there's a number of large banks and that have ESOP practices. I've been starting to see a few more Vermont scale banks getting involved, which is exciting to see as well. And then there's some other lenders like Vermont Economic Development Authority and kind of some of Vermont's regional development corporations have revolving loan funds and other things. So it's important, on the ESOP side, oftentimes the professionals are coming at the process from from a national. They're very knowledgeable of the national scene, but not so knowledgeable of the nuances of Vermont's kind of impact and economic development lending landscape. So it's important to not make sure you turn over those stones too as you're thinking about financing on the ESOP side. And with employee ownership trusts, they're newer, so usually it's seller financing is playing a big role. But I have seen some investors and others kind of expressing interest in them. So again, that's the new kid on the block. So there's still a lot to sort of learn and see as that kind of rolls out further. But one way or another, right? You assemble that debt package, and have the lawyers do their lawyer thing and do the transaction, and then the company is going to pay down the loan out of profitability. And so there's kind of a period of time where, just like say buying a house, or you might the company's putting out a lot of cash, but it's also building equity, right? As the the interest is an expense, but the principal payments that are being made on that mean that value is accruing even while the debt is there. And then once that debt is paid off, then the company's in an even better position to share value with owners. And maybe if it had to, on the case of something like a co-op or EOT, where it had limited cash to distribute to folks in those years where it's paying down the debt, now it has more flexibility to show bigger immediate financial benefits for employee ownership than it had while kind of paying down the loan that allowed it to make the transition. So just reviewing kind of advantages of doing one of these transactions, right? Being able to be flexible on timing, right? Folks can be kind of ready when they're ready versus having to be responsive to an outsider who says, all right, if you want to do this, we're doing this in the next 3 months, right? There's those tax incentives, both for deferring capital gains taxes for selling owners for ESOPs and worker co-ops. The ESOPs, S corporation ESOPs, essentially operating tax-free. There's some things around the worker co-op in terms of how profits distributed, that allow for that portion of the distribution to members to not be subject to payroll tax, things like that. The fair sale price, right? So again, not generally, company's not going to realize top dollar strategic value for this, but in most cases, companies aren't sold for strategic value. It's really that basis of that financial buyer versus the strategic buyer. And as in many cases, an employee ownership transaction can provide that that financial buyer price that allows for the exit on the timing that the owner that the owner wants, and with hopefully with the financing that allows for the owner to walk away from the table with a significant chunk of the total sale price in cash, but also with the expectation that and even from many lenders we see, like, they'd like to see the owner have some level of a vote of confidence in the future of the company, and so holding some amount of paper for as long as the lead lender also has exposure is a is a powerful signal to them that the owner believes that the company is going to continue and be successful with the new leadership and new management, new employees. And in some cases, the owner might actually stick around for a number of years, either as a employee, sometimes even as an employee owner, or as sort of a consultant or advisor to make sure that management leadership transition happens in a way that lays the groundwork for success. So when as a business owner is thinking about this, or you know someone who's kind of like, oh, I've been considering what am I going to do with my business, and you might think, hey, have you thought about employee ownership? Right? There's kind of 5 steps to really think about, right? And this is, the first is kind of setting goals. So from the perspective of an owner, what are their goals financially? What are their goals for the business? What are their goals for other stakeholders around the business, right? And when they're thinking about their options, figuring out does employee ownership check the boxes necessary to say yes, this is what I want to do, right? The second piece is assessing the resources of the business, right? And one thing that we haven't talked too much about, but I do want to emphasize here, is the question of management capacity and succession. In many small businesses, the owner is very load bearing, right? There's a lot of hats that they wear that no one else wears, and if they went away for a month, they come back and there wouldn't be a business left, or it would be in rough shape. And so, you know, especially as folks are planning and sort of starting this journey, making sure that there's an intentional approach to management succession, whether that's internal and building up the employee owner's capacity, or external, hiring in someone new. And so, the third piece is exploring options, right? Looking at these different options and really making a menu of what are the possible futures for this business, and what are the things that are of those possibilities? What are the things that are worth investing time and treasure into actually seriously studying and determining if that's the path to go. The fourth item is, actually then once you've done that feasibility work, selecting the path that you want to take, right? And it's always like, that's your first choice, but making sure that there's contingency plans, because life happens, reality happens, and sometimes your first choice isn't what actually is going to work. And so, but really sort of like doing the homework first to make sure that you're able to do the make a clean decision about that. And then once you're really like, all right, I know what direction I'm going, engaging with the folks who can help you with that, whether that's starting with evaluators. Great exercise to do is valuation, to just get grounded in this whole thing, right? ESOP process is going to require a number of professionals, and so it's a fairly, again, highly regulated and relatively complex process, and so need support there. And then on the co-op side, if the employees are going to be on the buy side, oftentimes they need some support, and that's something that folks like us, Cooperative Development Institute, others can do some project management and education to really make sure that they're able to effectively go through the process. And then finally, I'm going to end with a pitch for our big annual event. This is a great opportunity for folks in employee-owned companies to learn about employee ownership, and how to best take advantage of it. And for folks who are exploring and new to the idea, there's a track that's specifically about, both exploring these options in more detail, learning from professionals, and there's plenty of opportunities. I think it's something where people often start with, this is an interesting idea, but it's different where something that really can make a big difference is actually having opportunities to talk to people who are doing employee ownership day to day, to really understand what it means in their companies and what advice that they have. And sitting around those lunch tables, with folks who are coming from employee-owned companies, to be able to have those conversations, as I found for many business owners or key employees who are exploring this, can be super valuable. So Friday, May 30th, we'll be at the DoubleTree Hilton in Burlington, or I think. And then, so if you're interested, and you can sign up for our mailing list to learn more. Of course, we'll be posting this on social media and everything else. And I did have one question from Ryan about if we can send recording of this to a business owner exploring succession options. Yes, absolutely. This is again, every month on Employee Ownership Month, we try to offer just one of these general introductory sessions. So this is public and free to share around. So With that, yeah, if there's any final question, we're right about at time. Um, but the otherwise, definitely, if you have a question, further questions or comments, anything else that you'd like to engage with, my email is matt, at veoc.org. And we're always happy to chat with folks and kind of explore this option for them. So with that, I will say thank you all for attending today, and uh, hope you have a joyful and fun employee ownership month and many happy returns.